Okay, so we just wrapped up part one of the new Keynesian model. Now we're on part two. So in the last lecture, we went through like some of the micro foundation setups, and we really spent a majority of our time talking about the nominal rigidities, or the fact that prices are slow to adjust. That slow adjustment process in prices is what leads to an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And that is how the central bank can try to manipulate output by moving the aggregate demand curve either up or down this upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. And that will be affecting output in the short run, but not the long run. Now, I explained probably in excruciating detail without any actual like pictures or anything like that in the last lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to expand a little bit more. We're going to look at some pictures and we're going to talk about um, the equation that the central bank uses to actually understand where interest rates and inflation should be relative to output. So here we go. Central bank. I talked about this thing a lot last time. We're going to talk more about it explicitly rather than just sort of implicitly mentioning this is what they can do and this is why they can do it. What do they do? Well, they sort of manage the money supply. They do so by really setting an interest rate. They set the interest rate and they allow the money supply to be set accordingly. So think like demand and supply for money. If you set the price of money, then the quantity of money will follow. And all of this follows from what's now called a Taylor rule, which is named after this guy named John Taylor, who's like super, super awesome. Now, who is John Taylor? Well, he's an economic researcher, and the cool thing is, about 6 years ago, I think it was 6 years ago, yeah, about 6 years ago, maybe seven, um, Donald Trump, when he was president, selected Jerome Powell to be the Fed chairman. And Jerome Powell was then reappointed by President Biden about 2 years ago. So the Fed chairman has 4-year terms. Jerome Powell will be set to be, stepping down in about 2 years. So whoever's president 2 years from now will be determining who the Fed chairman is going to be for anywhere between 4 and 8 years. Generally speaking, it's probably going to be 8 years. The Regardless of who is in office, the president tends to just renominate the Fed chairman that was selected by the previous president, if that's the case, um, for a second term. So they generally serve 2 terms. It's kind of been the status quo for a while up until either 2017 or 2018. I don't remember exactly when. Donald Trump was supposed to renominate Janet Yellen, and he let her go and then selected Jerome Powell instead. Not really sure if that was that great of an idea, but such is life. So he decided not to renominate Janet Yellen, who was a fine chairperson of the Fed. But he had a very short list of possible candidates. John Taylor was one of them. And as we'll see when we learn about the Taylor rule, having John Taylor set as Fed chairman would have been absolutely like fantastic. And one of Trump's biggest mistakes during his presidency is really not making John Taylor chairman of the Fed. I'm actually still like really pissed about that. And there's a whole thing about him trying to fire Jerome Powell because the Fed's plans to tighten monetary policy. And those plans have been in the work for, I don't know, almost a decade before Trump even decided to run. So, yeah, enough about that. Um, Anywho, Taylor rule. What is it? Well, it is an interest rate setting rule that formulates policy in terms of interest rates. And it has a nice little endogenous component of monetary policy. So there's like a feedback mechanism that's built into this equation. Now, the Taylor rule is the nominal interest rate equals the target inflation rate plus like the target real rate plus this alpha sub pi times inflation minus this pi star. What is pi star? Well, pi star in this case is like what the target inflation rate would be, what we want it to be. So if we have a 2% inflation rate, if inflation is above, well, what's inside these parentheses here will be positive, right? If we've got 5% inflation, but we want 2% inflation, well, we've got difference of 3% in here. And if we have higher than desired inflation, well, what happens to the interest rate? It increases. How much does it increase by? Well, it increases by 0.03, right? The difference between actual and desired inflation times this alpha pi, which is a positive parameter that explains the, how do I put this? Like the sensitivity of the Fed in setting their interest rate to changes in inflation. But then we also get this alpha y. This alpha y is telling us the sensitivity of the Fed in setting their interest rate to deviations of output from the flexible price output. So this YT minus YTF, that's the output gap you saw in the previous lecture. So if we have a positive output gap, well, what's going to happen? The central bank's going to want to increase the interest rate. And when they increase the interest rate, regardless of it being driven by inflation or output, generally a combination of both, when that happens, that will be reducing inflation and reducing output. And as these two terms are decreasing, what happens is the nominal interest rate also begins to fall. So that's where the feedback component or the endogenous component of monetary policy comes in. Now, we also have this epsilon MT, and this is a source of like monetary policy shock. So if you think about when we looked at the impulse response functions, testing out the real business cycle model, when I looked at changing having like a monetary policy shock, this is actually the source of that monetary policy shock. It's an exogenous term that is uncorrelated with everything else here, and it serves as the source of shocks to monetary policy. All right, so what happens if everything here is zero? Well, it means inflation is equal to its desired target rate of inflation. Output is equal to the flexible price output. So when the terms inside the parentheses are equal to each other, well, they zero out. And that leaves me with this right here. The nominal interest rate equals the sum of the inflation rate and the real interest rate. What is that? It's the Fisher equation. So when, why is this? There we go. So when the output gap and inflation gap are closed and they're equal to zero, then we have simply the Fisher equation, which is the relationship between real and nominal interest rates with inflation. But that's only the special case where the output gap and inflation gap are zero. They zero out because at that point, that's where actual output equals the flexible price output, which has an expected price level. Remember that E of pi on the graphs in the previous lecture? That's pi star. So we could also just set that E of pi there, right? That's the expected price level. That's what they want prices to be, or the expected inflation rate. Okay, so it's really just sort of an expansion on the Fisher equation. Okay, but the central bank plays another role because they face a trade-off between output and inflation. Now, you can kind of actually see that here because they're focused on both output and inflation in this model. They're not solely focused on one and not focused on the other at all, nor are they not focused on either one. They're focused on both. And there's a trade-off between them. Now, here you don't really see that trade-off that much. All this tells me is that the central bank cares about inflation and they care about output. But the trade-off itself between output and inflation isn't given by equation 1. We need something to tell us what that trade-off is. And that's something that's known as the Phillips curve. Now, other models screwed this idea up a little bit. Some were good, some were not quite so good. But, and this is where maybe my personal bias comes in, the new Keynesian model fixes it quite a bit. because it ties that source of nominal rigidities to the firm's real marginal costs, which gives me there's this source of nominal rigidities that are explained by something actually within the model, not just something that we sort of ad hoc assumes after the fact. So we get something that's known as the new Keynesian Phillips curve. Now, the Phillips curve is a trade-off between either unemployment and inflation or output and inflation. In this case, it's output and inflation. Now, this right here maybe doesn't make a whole lot of sense, maybe in this form. So let's play around with this a little bit, right? So we've got equation 3, it's the same as equation 2 here. All right, well, pi is just inflation. Beta is that discount factor that we've been learning about all semester. And we know, therefore, that the gamma times 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta omega over omega, well, that's the slope of the Phillips curve. How do we know that? Well, you've got inflation on the left-hand side, and then the right-hand side, you've got something to do with output. Now, you've got the expected inflation thing, but let's just assume that is just kind of like a constant for now. What we're interested in is that YT minus YTF. So with that YT minus YTF, that's the output stuff. So think like vertical axis is prices, horizontal axis is output. So that slope, that gamma times 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta omega over omega, that's the slope of the Phillips curve, right? That's the relationship between output and inflation. And it's reflecting the real marginal cost the firm faces as a function of firms that can and cannot change their prices. So if I were to take equation 3 and I were to solve it for YT, so I want YT on the left-hand side and everything else on the right-hand side, this is what I get. YT equals YTF plus 1 over gamma times omega over 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta omega times pi t minus expected inflation. So inflation, pi t, minus expected inflation, e of pi t plus 1. Okay. Now this is a little bit more intuitive. We can look at this because now we've got prices as a function of output, not the other way around. So we can play with this guy a little bit, and we can actually get a good bit of inference from this function. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to replace that whole 1 over gamma with omega and all that stuff with just alpha. And that's going to give me a really nice little equation. YT, current output, equals YTF, the flexible price output, plus alpha times inflation minus expected inflation. Now, if you've had my money and banking course, whether you're currently in it or you have taken it in the past, you're going to recognize equation 5. Because when we did the monetary policy and time inconsistency stuff, we're actually using this equation right here. This is where all this stuff really like comes together. So this equation is what's known as an expectations augmented Phillips curve. And it's, well, also the new Keynesian Phillips curve. Now, it being expectations augmented, that's really what what you will learn about or have learned about in money and banking. The source of the relationship between output and inflation in that case is from what's known as a signal extraction problem. But if we define it as above, where alpha is equal to 1 over gamma with the omega stuff and all that, that's more a source of nominal rigidities. But if you've taken money and banking, at least now you'll kind of recognize what you're looking at. You see how all this kind of comes together. So what does all this mean? Well, it means the central bank can influence output in the short run. Why? Because, well, firms can't all adjust their prices because we have this omega term. This omega term, remember, is greater than 0. It's less than 1, but it's greater than 0. So with that omega term, if it's greater than 0, you're going to have some firms that can't update their prices each period. And because some firms can't update their prices each period, that's where we end up with, hold on a second. that's where we end up with that upward sloping aggregate supply curve. So really, if we look at this, this is an aggregate supply curve. So this Phillips curve is really, if it's a Phillips curve for output, it's an aggregate supply curve. It's a relationship between output and inflation. So as this alpha term gets bigger, what's going on? Well, it's telling me that this omega term is getting bigger, right? If omega is getting bigger, what does that imply about the slope of the aggregate supply curve? Think about that for a little bit. So that explains how central banks can influence output in the short run because of that omega term. The larger omega is, the fewer firms can change their prices, the more firms can't change their prices. If firms can't change their prices, well, you end up with a flatter aggregate supply curve, at least for the short run. But in the long run, that omega to the power of n, as t goes to infinity, right, that shrinks down to 0. And as it goes to 0, it approaches 0, all firms can update their prices. And if all firms can update their prices, well, they're going to get smart. Why are they going to get smart? Because they're taking in past events to shape their future plans. So if the central bank screws with them a lot, and they screw with the money supply to try to screw with prices a lot in the short run, they do it fairly recently, firms are going to go, you're not tricking me again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, you're not going to fool me twice, because they're going to set higher prices than before in order to offset the negative effects of that shock that they had. So firms will set their prices above where they would have otherwise. Well, as prices increase, well, you have inflation. And if firms are expecting prices to be above where they were before, they're going to set prices to be above where they were planning on it to be before. And thus, you're going to have an increase in expected inflation. So not only are you triggering actual inflation, you're also triggering an increase in expected inflation. And for those of you who've had my money and banking course, increases in expected inflation are not good. And for those of you that have not had it, well, it's also not good. So the central bank can try to influence output in the short run, but they can never do it in the long run. They can always only do it in the short run. But the more they try to do it in the short run, the more it screws with prices, the more it pisses firms off, and the more firms increase their prices, which increases inflation. And as that expected price level keeps increasing at a rate above where it was before, you also have an increase in expected inflation. So think of it like this, right? You've seen the Matrix, right? You take the red pill or you take the blue pill. Well, if you're in blue pill world, you've got this upward sloping short run aggregate supply. If you're in red pill world, well, you took it. You woke up, you're out of the matrix, right? That's the long run aggregate supply. This long run aggregate supply is just the aggregate supply from the real business cycle model. This is that flexible price equilibrium, flexible price output, YTF, when you're looking at the output gap. And this short run aggregate supply, that's YT. So this is where we go back to how firms are going to be doing all their pricing stuff. Remember, they can't change the price every period like they could in the real business cycle model, because there's some probability, omega, that they can't change their prices. Thus, 1 minus omega is the probability that they can change their prices. So they got to be forward-looking when they actually are able to change their prices or set their prices. Now, if the Fed's been screwing with the money supply, these firms are going to want to set prices high enough to be able to cover their assets, cover their potential losses in the future. So the more the Fed inflates, the more firms are going to include that past behavior into their pricing strategy, and they're going to be setting higher prices as well. So how does this work? Right? Well, let's play with that slope of the Phillips curve a bit. So first we want to figure out what the slope of the Phillips curve is. Right? Well, we take that, where is it? Right here. That 1 over gamma times omega over 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta omega. All right, that's what the slope is. We just want to plug stuff in there now. So let's say 20% of the firms are unable to change their prices. So omega is 0.2. 1 minus omega is 0.8. Now, generally the case, you see a lot of like dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models where beta set at like 0.99. So we'll just let it be 0.99. And we're going to let gamma be 1. So the slope would be 1 over 1 times 0.2 over 1 minus 0.2 times 1 minus 0.99 times 0.2. Play with this a little bit, evaluate, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, that slope is 0.128. How does this relate inflation with output? Well, that tells me if I plug that in for alpha in that new Keynesian Phillips curve, I get YT equals YTF plus 0.128 times pi t minus E of pi t, inflation minus expected inflation. So most firms can change their prices. So deviations of inflation from expected inflation don't really matter all that much. Why is this? Well, if more firms can change their prices than those that can't, short-run aggregate supply is going to be less affected by inflation than, say, the flip side of that. 80% of firms can't change their prices. So what if firms had less flexibility in their pricing strategy? So let's say 80% of firms now can't change their price each period, but everything else is the same. Well, before, all right, 0.128. So if you have a 1% deviation of actual inflation from expected inflation, what happens? Well, here, that 1% increase is really only going to increase actual output, by 0.128. Okay, that's not that much, right? Kind of a lot, but not really. Let's look at what it would be like if 80% can't change their prices. So omega is now 0.8 rather than 0.2. So I plug that in, evaluate. Oh my God, slope of the Phillips curve is now 19.23, which means deviations from expected inflation really affect output in this case because fewer firms are actually able to change their prices. Here it was 0.128. Now you're probably going like, all right, well, 0.128, I don't know what that is relative to anything else. Well, relative to 19.23, that's a much smaller number. So instead of 0.128, that's 19.23 in there. So now, if there's a deviation of inflation from expected inflation that you see in equation 6, it's not increasing by 0.128, it's increasing output by 19.23. That's massive. So what's this look like graphed out? Because you're seeing the numbers, but like maybe the numbers don't mean all that much. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, who knows? New Keynesian Phillips curve relates output with inflation. So it's an aggregate supply curve, like I'd said earlier. So it's a short-run aggregate supply because in the long run, aggregate supply is independent of prices. So remember, we only had one aggregate supply curve in the real business cycle model, which was the long-run aggregate supply. Now we've got two, long-run and short-run aggregate supply. So the LRAS, that's the long-run aggregate supply. That is the aggregate supply from the real business cycle model. The new Keynesian model gives us a short-run aggregate supply, and I've got two examples of short-run aggregate supply here. I have a flexible price and I have a sticky price. The steeper the short-run aggregate supply curve gets, the more flexible the prices are. The flatter short-run aggregate supply gets, the stickier prices are. So when we have stickier prices, that means that omega term is really big because there are more firms that are unable to change their prices relative to firms that are able to change their prices. When more firms can change their prices, prices are relatively flexible. They're more flexible than considered otherwise. So if you see a short-run aggregate supply that's relatively steep, prices are very flexible. The flatter it is, prices are a little bit more sticky. So these nominal rigidities, what I like about it so much is that it links that inability to alter prices with the firm's real marginal cost. So there's like an economically intuitive approach rather than just going like, well, it is because it is. Well, here it is because the real marginal costs are being affected for the firm, and that inability to change prices around the real marginal costs, well, that makes sense. We can see what's going on here. And because there's that inability, there's that disconnect between the ability to set prices and the firm's real marginal costs, that's where the monetary authority has the ability to use monetary policy to try to influence output. Now, remember, they're not influencing supply-side factors. They're only influencing demand-side factors. But if you can shift that demand curve along the upward-sloping aggregate supply curve, then you're actually changing economic activity. But because these are demand-side and not supply-side factors, they're not permanent. If you have a supply shock, right, well, that supply shock will always be permanent. The shock won't last forever, right? But the effects of the shock, that boost in output's never going to go back down. It's always going to be at least where it was before, unless there's like some negative shock. But let's assume away negative output shocks for a second, right? Just on average, if there's this technology increase, like, the internal combustion engine gets made, well, no one's going back to a horse and buggy anytime soon. We're all sticking with the internal combustion engine. Now, who knows? Maybe in like 30, 40 years, we're all driving EVs around. I don't know. I kind of like the internal combustion engine myself, but it's neither here nor there. I'm that old man who's, going to be sort of rotated out of the world relatively soon, I guess. Anyways, if prices can't change, right? If prices are not totally flexible, because here, prices are totally flexible. Here, they're really sticky. So if demand were to move along this blue short-run aggregate supply curve, prices don't move very much, output moves a ton. So if aggregate demand shifts out, well, prices can't move all that much, and if prices can't move, in order to maintain equilibrium between aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, is to have output move a little bit. Output has to pick up whatever slack is left by the lack of movement in price, and that's done to maintain an equilibrium. But like I'd said earlier, right, we can't just do this forever. Maybe you'd think we could do this forever, and, at face value, maybe you're like, okay, it would make sense to be able to do this forever. But as I've said, there are real effects. Maybe not real effects. There are effects. In the short run, there are real effects of monetary expansion. In the long run, there are no real effects, but there are still nominal effects. And those nominal effects aren't good. Short run, yeah, we do get changes in output. Long run, no change in output anymore. Price picked up all the slack. Price fully moved. All right, everyone takes the red pill, and they're unplugged from the matrix. Firms start to catch on to what the central bank's doing, and they set their higher expected price level than it was before to make sure they don't get screwed again. So if central banks try to boost output all the time with monetary expansion, well, they end up paying a price of very high inflation. No pun intended, I promise. Now, you're probably going like, but wait a minute, Jeremy. I thought you said that firms are always trying to set their price above what the real marginal cost is to kind of make up for any expected future losses. That's true. They do that. But the thing is, it's an expected future loss. It's not guaranteed that's what their loss is going to be. Maybe they don't lose anything. Maybe they come out ahead a little bit. Cool. Maybe they lose something and they come out behind. Well, if that's the case, they've got to set their price even higher, not just to offset future losses, but also to try to make up for what they've lost in the past as well. And this actually happened during the 1970s. And I know in the book, I think I go on about like the lost decade in one of the growth models, one of those chapters. This is actually kind of where it came from. We had really, really high inflation, and a lot of it was the result of central banks for decades before trying to manipulate output to be constantly above what that flexible price output would be. Now, They didn't have the real business cycle and new Keynesian models in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They didn't really know what a lot of this stuff was. A lot of the terms that I'm even using now weren't really around back then. They didn't really quite get that you couldn't permanently engineer higher than average inflation, or higher than like, flexible price equilibrium inflation, or output. I mean, not inflation. They were just like, let's try to get higher output. We want higher output. But as they were playing with it, they learned that really tough lesson of, you do that, you're going to have higher inflation. Now, there were a lot of economists that saw it coming. The entire monetary school of economics really saw that coming. Milton Friedman talked about it a lot. But the prevailing sense of things in like the policymaker world, the ones that Congress and the president want to actually listen to, they were saying things like, just keep raising the money supply, keep increasing the money supply, because if we do that, well, you're going to get higher output. But eventually we settled on high inflation and high expected inflation, and that's when Paul Volcker came in and really cut the money supply to try to bring inflation and expected inflation back down, and he did so very drastically, very quickly. Okay, enough about that. So long-run aggregate supply is independent of prices, and it's pretty obvious to us now that short-run aggregate supply isn't. So if the current price level changes, well, we're going to end up at a new point of like YT on the same short-run aggregate supply. Now, if the expected price level changes, then it shifts, and firms alter their prices based on expectations of the future. So if the monetary authority screws with the money supply, then the price level is going to be going up. And firms expect that moving forward. They're going to expect higher prices in the future, so they're going to increase their expected price level, which shifts short-run aggregate supply upward. And with that upward shift in aggregate demand, that, you could think of that as like kind of good, right? An upward shift in short-run aggregate supply means firms are supplying the same quantity, but now at a higher price. So if short-run aggregate supply shifts up, it's bad. This is that illustrated. So we start at the blue. So we've got YT0 and AD0. This YT0 is short-run aggregate supply. YT0 equals AD0 equals YTF. Now, YTF isn't moving anywhere. Why? Because there are no supply-side factors shifting this guy either right or left. It's just going to stay put where it is, because these are all demand-side things we're looking at. This is not a supply-side shock. So we initially start out expected price level, E PT0. That expected price level occurs when YTF is equal to AD0 equals YT0. Aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply equals long-run aggregate supply. Now, when there's a monetary policy shock, what happens is aggregate demand shifts out. This is where we would start out, right? We would want the price level to be here and output to be here. So we'd want this price level where this mouse is moving, and we'd want this level of output. But we can't really have that, can we? No. Why not? Because short-run aggregate supply is up here, not down here. So aggregate demand shifts out horizontally, and then we walk up this little hill here. Walk. Oh, boom, here we are. YT0. So AD1 equals YT0 is the new short-run equilibrium. This is where the mouse currently is. This is our new short-run equilibrium. Output is here. Prices would be here. But this is short-run. Long-run, what happens is, as more firms can change their prices, let's say one firm can change its price. Well, in that case, this YT0, the blue YT, might shift to where this mouse is moving now. It's up a little bit, not much, but just a little bit. And as more firms can change their prices, this YT0 shifts up to this YT1. This YT1 is that inward, or I guess upward shift of short-run aggregate supply. Now notice, firms are supplying the same quantity as before, but now at a higher price, at a higher expected price level. That higher expected price level occurs because as more firms can change their prices, as more firms can update their prices, trying to move forward, they're now in a situation where they're like, okay, we got to set a higher price level because the central bank screwed with us before. They're probably going to screw with us again. So now we have a higher expected price level, a higher overall price level, but output is exactly where it was prior to the aggregate demand shock. So in the short run, yes, you can increase output. In the long run, however, all you increased were prices. So if, say, we are in a recession, and the central bank believes it is able to pull us out of a recession by pulling aggregate demand up, increasing aggregate demand. Cool. We increase output. We may increase output above that flexible price equilibrium even. In the short run. In the long run, all firms can update their prices, and this YT0 shifts up to YT1. And this YT0, short run aggregate supply 0, shifting up to short run aggregate supply 1, it's going to shift up exactly to the point where you have an equilibrium of long run aggregate supply, or YTF, and the new aggregate demand curve. That's when it stops. So if we have, say, a price level here where short run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand, but these two curves are not equal to long run aggregate supply, you would just have, say, P1 or P0 prime or something like that. But when all three of these are equal, aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, all equal each other, then you have an expected price level, because now you've converged to a point where all firms were able to update their prices. So you get a money supply increase. I didn't draw that in here, right? That's the LM stuff, which takes place above the aggregate demand and aggregate supply space. You have a money supply increase, shifts the LM curve, which triggers a shift in the, it says AAD0, so it's just be AD0, curve up to AD1. The magic of editing, it's gone. So it's just AD0 up to AD1. So when AD shifts out, aggregate demand is shifting out, we're deviating from that long-run aggregate supply, which is YTF here, up the short-run aggregate supply, which is just YT. This increases the price a bit, but it also increases output. As more firms get to update their prices, YT shifts in, or really up, as the expected price level increases. And we end up back at YTF, or long-run aggregate supply, where YT equals YTF equals AD1, and we have a higher expected price level. So if the Fed increases the money supply more, the price level goes up by more. So in the short run, they could always technically, if they wanted to, increase output above the flexible price output. But the problem with that is they're always going to have to deal with higher rates of inflation. Inflation will always have to increase in order to get this to happen, because as we settle into a new equilibrium, a new long-run equilibrium, well, prices are going to be higher, inflation would be higher, and the only way to change that, the only way to increase output again would be to have higher than current inflation. Well, if inflation's already high, we go from 2% to 4%, we settle at 4% inflation, they want to increase output above the flexible price output again, we might have to go to 6%. Well, then when we're at 6%, if they want to increase it again, we're going to have to go up to 7 or 8%. So it keeps increasing. And the more they try to increase the money supply, the more they're going to be increasing inflation. Because ultimately, prices are just a rationing mechanism. It's a way to go, look, we have finite resources, right? We don't have infinite resources. If we had infinite resources, well, pricing mechanism would be very, very different than the way it is now. But we've got finite resources. So we have to ration them out some way, shape, or form. Price is just one way to ration out these limited resources. So if more and more people want the same number of goods, what happens? You have to raise the price in order to ration out those goods. That's what happens here. That's why the monetary authority can't just consistently increase the money supply. There are quote-unquote limits to monetary expansion. So the central bank can boost output above the output gap, or to give us a positive output gap in the short run, because all firms can't adjust their prices all at once. But once all the firms can adjust their prices, they set a higher price and they're forward looking. So it's set because they expect the Fed to screw with them again. And they set a high price now as like a precaution for the future, which does eventually hurt consumers. So the central bank can't always try this because, well, it screws everyone over if they push too hard with it. That's what happened in, well, what culminated in the high inflation in the 1970s. Now, in the 1970s, they didn't just have high inflation. That would be bad enough. They also had high unemployment. That's what's known as stagflation. So you get like the worst of both worlds. You get the high inflation from the expansionary monetary policy stuff, but you get the low employment or the high unemployment that you'd think would normally come with like more contractionary monetary policy. But people settled into an equilibrium where there was high inflation and high unemployment. So the central bank kind of backed itself into a corner, and they had to do something really nasty and drastic, which is cut the money supply, threw the economy into a recession for a while. But then we had, 30, almost 40 years of economic prosperity that followed from that. So, there's something to be said for it. That's all I'm going to say. All right, so the graphs. I think I want to spend a little bit more time on the graphs later, but maybe we can just go through this a little bit so you can just get exposed to it. There's a short-run aggregate supply curve in this model, so demand shocks do matter. And if demand shocks matter, well, we got a lot more shocks to consider that aren't just going to mess with the prices. So anything that triggers an aggregate demand shock will have real effects in the short run. Maybe not necessarily in the long run, but at least in the short run. And this is what's known as the neoclassical synthesis. The best way to put it is shit happens in the short run, but not the long run. There's this economist, Joram Bauman. He hails himself as a stand-up economist. His stand-up's kind of funny, actually. I'd look him up if I were you. There's some pretty funny stuff. One of them is like, all the shit happens. I think there was like a shit happens for like different religions. And it was like, I don't believe this shit for some of, like for atheism, it's like, I don't believe this shit. Something like that. There's something like that for all these different religions. It was actually pretty funny. But he sort of took that and then just did shit happens for like schools of thought and economics. And when it came to the neoclassical synthesis, basically it was that it happens in the short run, but not in the long run, which I thought was very funny and also hilariously accurate. The idea is that demand shocks can have real effects in the short run, but they don't have real effects in the long run. And that is essentially tying Keynesian and more classical schools of economics together, going, they actually both work, they just work under different time horizons. In the sense of like the new Keynesian and the real business cycle model, or another way to refer to the real business cycle model is like the neoclassical business cycle model. The neoclassical business cycle model says demand shocks don't have any real effects. The new Keynesian model says demand shocks do have real effects. Well, they can't both be right. They can't both be wrong. But they actually are both right, just in different time horizons. New Keynesian model is right in the short run in terms of predicting what the real effects will be in response to an aggregate demand shock. The neoclassical model, or the real business cycle model, is correct in the long run in predicting what the effects of demand shocks will be with output. So this is what a money supply shock looks like in the new Keynesian model. You have an increase in the LM curve, or shifting out of the LM curve, which then drags aggregate demand out. We learned this a little bit with the real business cycle model. But what happens is, in the new Keynesian model, the LM curve doesn't shift all the way back. It just shifts partly back to bring us to an equilibrium point between short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And then here we draw a little dotted line down over to that diagonal curve, over, and then up. So here, well, we have a higher level of output being produced via this production function. There's no shift in the production function, remember. It's just moving to a new point in the production function. And then we draw that line up to where labor demand will be along this upward sloping labor supply curve. So these are the short-run effects of a monetary policy shock in the new Keynesian model. So these are like static responses, right? So the IS or LM shock, either way, is going to trigger a demand shock, whether it's real business cycle or new Keynesian model. But that was what we saw was an LM shock, right? We want to look at an IS shock. Well, that's like a preference shock from the household, government spending shock, or investment demand shock. Either way, IS shifts out, which pushes aggregate demand out. Well, looks like I got another monetary policy shock here. Okay. What the hell? Okay, here we go. All right, sorry. These slides are a little screwed up. My mistake. All right, well, what happens here? The IS curve shifts out. The amount that it shifts out drags aggregate demand out, right? But we're not in equilibrium here because we want to be where aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are equal to each other, so we want to be here. But currently we're here. How do we get here? Well, we get here by the LM curve coming in. Because remember, as prices increase, the LM curve shifts in. But as the LM curve is shifting in from an increase in prices, you get no shift in aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Why? Because, well, price is defined on this vertical axis. So if the variable on the vertical or horizontal axis is being defined as in terms of what's moving in another graph, what moves in that graph will be shifting a curve around, but it won't be here because, well, it's defined in here. So what's going on? So the LM curve shifts in due to an increase in the price level. So we move along this aggregate demand up to this point where short-run aggregate supply and AD1 are equal to each other, giving us a price level PT1. Now that increases the real interest rate from our initial point, RT0, up to RT1, which is where we were over here. And the real interest rate increases a little bit more as the LM curve shifts in more and more and more. So now we're here, PT1, and we'll call it like, I don't know, YT1 over here. So a higher output and a higher price level. Now note, this PT1 is not E of PT1 because it's not an expected price level because this is not a long-run equilibrium. This is a short-run equilibrium. So here we draw this dotted line down over to this point right here on the production function. Again, there's no shift in the production function because there's no increase in technology here, right? Monetary policy shocks, or in this case, fiscal policy shocks, neither one will be changing technology. Now, they might try to tell you otherwise. They might try to act like, their behavior is changing things on the supply side, but it's not, right? They're more or less orthogonal to each other. So then you draw a dotted line upward to labor supply up here, and then you're going to shift labor demand out to where we have an equilibrium in labor markets. And this is the short-run equilibrium in response to a fiscal policy shock. So if we look at the monetary policy shock, right, what happens? Well, here the LM curve shifts out and then up, so the real interest rate drops a little bit and then kind of comes back up. And then we have an increase in prices, an increase in output, an increase in real wages, and an increase in employment. With the fiscal policy shock, what do we have? Well, the IS curve shifts out first. Note, in the monetary policy shock, the IS curve never moves. It's just the LM curve moving. In the fiscal policy shock, the IS curve moves, but then the LM curve moves afterwards. So what we get is first we have an increase in the real interest rate and then another increase in the real interest rate. And that leads to a price level above the expected price level. So prices go up, output goes up, real wages increase, labor increases. So question, can we identify a monetary policy from a fiscal policy shock in this model? Think about that. Pause it for a second, look at both of them, and see what thing moves differently. And I'm not so much looking at the curves moving, I'm looking at what the variables are that are moving. So think about that for a second. Push pause. Okay, welcome back. So what happened? Well, in the monetary policy shock, the real interest rate drops. I guess it kind of increases, but we settle in at a short-run equilibrium with a lower, IS shock. Where's the... I lost my spot. Okay, here we are. Monetary policy shock. So we end up with a lower interest rate than where we were before. But output, prices, wages, and employment all increase. So they move in the same direction, but the interest rate moves down here. Looking at the IS shock, right? Well, like I said, they all move in the same direction, the monetary policy shock, with the exception of the real interest rate. The real interest rate increases, and we settle in a short run equilibrium where the real interest rate is above where it started, whereas in the monetary policy shock, it's below where it started. So we can identify the two. There's a difference between the two, at least one difference. So in the real business cycle model, right, an aggregate demand shock wouldn't really do anything except increase prices and the real interest rate. But in the new Keynesian model, prices still increase, but they don't increase by as much because output also moves. So, like what we got here. So this is the short run set of responses to the IS shock in the new Keynesian model. Right? So to maintain that equilibrium, the LM curve shifts up because, well, that's what it does when the price level goes up. On the supply side, there's an increase in labor demand. And it's because people want more output. Output responds to an aggregate demand shock here because prices are sticky. So firms need more labor to satisfy that demand shock. So labor goes up, wages go up. And these are the short-run responses to a monetary policy and fiscal policy shock in the new Keynesian model. And that's going to wrap up this stuff for now. I think I want to spend a little bit more time with the graphs in the new Keynesian model. So be on the lookout. There's going to be more videos regarding like the graphs and different types of responses to shocks and all that. And maybe if there's time permitting, I believe there is, but time permitting, we might even be able to look at the differences in the responses to real shocks, because ultimately they're going to end up being the same, but there's a transition process. So best way to think of it, real business cycle model is where we're going to end up. The new Keynesian model describes the transition process to getting to where we're going to end up. But yeah, I think that's enough. I've talked for about 50 minutes here. So thank you for watching this. Be on the lookout next week for more lectures. But in the meantime, enjoy this. Thank you for watching. Good luck on the test that you're working on. And I will see you next week.